All right, it looks like the waiting room is cleared. We can get started, and whoever comes to join us will join us. So thank you all for being here. I am excited to let you in behind the scenes on some of the most impactful reporting that we have done in the last few months. Andrew Lapin, who's here with me, has done this reporting. I've just edited. Um, and it's about a topic that many, many of our readers and many Jews care deeply about, which is what is happening in American colleges and universities right now, particularly around the safety of Jewish students and the conversation about Israel. So I'm going to frame our conversation just a little bit. You sent questions, and I've incorporated those into our plans for the conversation. We'll have more time for questions, so just type your questions in the chat um, as we go, and we'll pick up on those. But I mostly want you to hear from Andrew. So we'll jump right in. So I'll just say, I think everyone here knows, and it's impossible to miss that almost immediately after Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, activity related to Israel and the war that it declared started unfolding on college campuses in the United States. I was looking back at our early coverage, and the first time Harvard appeared in one of our headlines, I believe, was on Monday morning, and we felt like maybe that was a little late. So this was right away. And it wasn't just one moment, it was a kind of explosion. I think that's what the Biden administration actually used that word to describe what it said was an explosion of anti-Semitism on campuses. There's definitely a little bit of a debate about what it is that we're seeing, but there's no question that what's happening has caused a great deal of anxiety among Jews in the United States. It's being closely watched by Jews around the world, and that many people have taken action to shape what happens next at colleges and universities. There's a lot of fear and a lot of feelings, and this is a very live situation for actual Jewish students who are really wrapped up in something that is happening around them. So we heard in your questions, there's a lot of practical questions. We want to try and tackle those as we go. We want to leave you with some real answers to your questions, but I'll caution you that this is a world of murkiness, and no one knows that better than Andrew Lapin, who's been covering this since the beginning. And I really want us to hear from him. So first, I guess, Andrew, you've been working tirelessly to stay on top of a fire hose of reports coming out of colleges, campuses in the United States. Like, how did you know? Maybe you can take us back to the beginning. Like, when did you realize this was like a thing? And how did you know how did you start thinking about your coverage?
Sure. Thank you, Felissa. Thanks, everybody, for being here. We certainly knew very quickly that that the events of October 7th and everything that has followed it were going to impact American Jews on a lot of fronts, and that one of the biggest ones was going to be on campuses. And that's partially because I've been covering the issue of college campuses since even before October 7th. There's been a lot of attention around what anti-Semitism looks like on campuses, how you define it, how you legislate it or not. These have been already sort of raging debates among many Jewish circles and many of the sort of biggest, most prestigious, most progressive campuses nationwide. And as you noted, it only took a few days after the events of the 7th for us to publish a story about letters that had been signed by students and student groups at Harvard and Columbia and other places that had a lot of inflammatory rhetoric on them, that were blaming Israel entirely, these sorts of things. What we saw happening was that administrators of kind of the biggest schools around were not sure how to respond in this moment, and their hesitancy to do so in many cases created a vacuum that was quickly filled not only by student activists, but also by a lot of outside groups that we tend to keep our eye on in this space. And there was a lot of attention being paid on how these campuses were going to respond to this explosion of activism, and how donors were going to react, how the sort of established Jewish institutions, Hillel, the ADL, et cetera, that had already been paying very close attention to the experiences of Jewish students on college campuses, what their reactions were going to be. And this was all before, of course, the viral congressional hearing in December that has cost the job of the presidents of Harvard and Penn. And so what we saw and what I found was interesting was that I was hearing all these reports, very widely publicized by the Biden administration, about so-and-so campus being investigated for anti-Semitism on a federal level. And there were many federal investigations being opened into this thing called Title VI violations, which have been framed as civil rights violations, which had already been a part of the conversation around Jewish students for a few years, riding up to October 7th. And then we saw that activity really increase after October 7th. And the more and more universities that sort of came in, were coming under the microscope, that we were being told were being investigated, the less I seemed to know or understand about the mechanics behind those investigations. And so already there was a question that I felt like needed to be answered and that I wanted to try to get my hands on. And so that's where this reporting project really started.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you could have taken like 100 different cuts at what's happening at colleges and universities and fully occupied yourself. And you really identified early on that Title VI was like a lens to do a focused look at a lot of the different dynamics that are playing out, and also to shift our coverage to make sure that our coverage is rooted in a response to allegations of anti-Semitism so that we can try and figure out what's happening in the solution space. Because I think you could spend, our entire staff could be fully occupied in writing up incidents that somebody of any background or any ideological orientation would identify as a problem. And I think we decided that we're going to pick a spot. Let's pick a spot that's solutions oriented. And I think we've learned something from that. So I guess, Andrew, could you just like back up for a second and tell everybody here exactly what Title VI is and how you realized that like that should be your priority, or how you decided that should be your priority?
Yeah, of course. So Title VI is a part of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was passed initially to address segregation in American public schools. It basically holds that discrimination on any front is forbidden at federally funded institutions. And so the various departments of the federal government interpret Title VI in different ways. For our purposes, we're interested in how the Department of Education thinks about Title VI and how it has thought about it most recently. In most recent years, new guidelines passed under first the Bush and then the Trump administrations that expanded what it meant to have Title VI protections as a Jewish student or as a student who is Israeli, who has some matter of shared Israeli heritage, shared ancestry is the language used by the discrimination law, or a student who might want to express your Zionism on campus. Suddenly, you could find language within Title VI that protected you, and then the way that this mechanic works is that the wronged party or somebody on behalf of the wronged party files a discrimination complaint with the Department of Education, alleging that there has been a Title VI violation at such and such school during this period of time, targeting students from this particular marginalized community. And that can be a range of things, but the guidelines that the Department of Education has set out say that they are supposed to respond not to when something anti-Semitic, for example, happens on campus, but to what the university does about it once it has learned about it. And they are supposed to respond not to isolated incidents, one or two incidents, but to larger patterns of what they call hostile learning environments, or severe and pervasive discrimination or harassment. Those are the guidelines that the Department of Education has set out to investigate. And as you mentioned, there have, of course, been a lot of headline-grabbing activities on campus, things that we are very concerned about. Reports of Jewish students being physically assaulted on campus, death threats, rape threats, all sorts of really intense and horrific activities, and then a lot of stuff that kind of fits into a legalistic gray area. Things like how students that carry signs that say "from the river to the sea," how do the federal authorities define that phrase? Do they define it as an anti-Semitic, or do they define it as free speech? And all of these things are sort of existing together in the space of Title VI right now, because even though the Department of Education has these guidelines about what they use Title VI for, in reality, in practice, what we see is that those guidelines are very easily manipulated. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of outside groups that have filed Title VI complaints because anybody is allowed to file them. You do not have to be personally connected to the campus on which you are filing, to the victims you are filing on behalf of, and you also do not have to prove or demonstrate that there has been, this sort of pattern of harassment, because the department's Office of Civil Rights, which is what handles Title VI, has pledged, has vowed openly and vowed specifically to the Jewish community that they will open any complaint they receive for a full investigation. Investigations can mean that they can compel administrators at the university to sit down with them, share them on files, extensive documentation showing what they knew at what point about what kind of harassment was being experienced by students on campus. They can force the university to pledge reforms, to pledge concrete steps they will take to protect these students on campus. And if the university refuses to do that, the Department of Education can threaten to withhold federal funding until it fixes the problem. So it is this very powerful enforcement mechanism that has been somewhat loosely defined in our current moment.
You said a lot of things I think that are really interesting, and I guess I'll try and pack two questions into one. One is, that sounds like a lot of bureaucratic work, that's sitting down and looking at documents and hearing about plans and reviewing emails, and I guess, what do we know about the practical implications for students? What's the time? I'll do one question at a time. What's the timeline like? And will students today feel the effect of an investigation opened over something that has happened to them? And like, what do we know from the past about the course that these investigations take and the impact that they have?
Yes. So the way these investigations are supposed to work is that once a complaint has been filed, the department, after a reasonable amount of time, something of a few weeks, will generally open the complaint up for a formal investigation, and it pledges to wrap up all investigations within 180 days. That is traditionally how it has worked. That timeline very much does not seem to be plausible in the current moment. Of course, we have not yet hit 180 days since October 7th, which is when the main influx of these investigations have been opened. So, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but the department does have several outstanding active investigations going back years. And so it can take months to years to go through this arbitration process, which is not a legal process, but it is something that is being handled in private between lawyers for the Department of Education and senior personnel at these universities. Over the course of these months to years, the representatives, the complainant, sort of makes the case for why the university should have done more to protect Jewish students, and the university will either dispute that it didn't do enough within the bounds of what it can legally do on a college campus, or it will, after some time, admit, yes, I could have done more. Here is what I will pledge to do instead, and it can be anything from we will spend some money to build a new Jewish center, to we will improve our anti-Semitism training for faculty and staff, to we will improve our bias reporting system, all manner of things that we have seen that a small handful of anti-Semitism related resolutions have actually produced at schools such as the University of Vermont, or more recently, a K through 12 district in Delaware that agreed to financially compensate the family of a Jewish student who had experienced harassment and discrimination on their campus. The rate at which these investigations are being opened, combined with what we know, which is that the department is currently underfunded and has been trying to petition Congress to increase its funding so that it can hire more investigators, but has not been able to do that yet, tells us that it is dealing with far more discrimination complaints in this particular area of shared ancestry than it has in quite some time. And so it's not clear what the reasonable or expected time frame is for them to actually produce results and for Jewish students on these campuses to actually see some sort of tangible benefit from it.
I mean, it sounds like it could take a really long time. And so maybe you could spend a minute just sharing like what are the other kinds of responses that we are seeing right now and how someone who's seeking redress or concerned about anti-Semitism on their campus might weigh the different strategies that are being used.
Yes. So Title VI has been promoted by the Biden administration as a relatively low effort way for students to seek redress in this moment because you don't need a lawyer. Anybody can file a complaint. But these are the results that it produces. It is uncertain. It's what we've been referring to as the Wild West kind of situation. There are certainly other routes that students can go. Many have filed lawsuits in federal court. A lawsuit will have the effect of superseding any active Title VI investigation that the Department of Education is going on. It has going on into the same things. But we have seen lawsuits from all manner of current students, alums, families, alleging everything from, again, the university failed to protect me to the university's lackluster response to anti-Semitism has actually devalued my degree. And so all sorts of things. Most of them are still working their way through the courts. And so it remains to be seen sort of how effective the legal maneuverings will be in this instance. And we are also seeing um, donor and political pressures being applied, especially to some of the more high-profile cases. Several Harvard administrators have been subpoenaed by Congress, by the Education Subcommittee, specifically related to an investigation they're doing about the university's response to anti-Semitism. And then there are these big pressure campaigns being led by some very prominent alumni, including the hedge fund investor Bill Ackman at Harvard, as well as similar organizations heading up Jewish students, Jewish alums at other kinds of schools that are trying to put increased pressure on the universities. In response, some of these universities, I think, would prefer to be handling these matters internally. And so we have seen that they are creating these anti-Semitism task forces or committees that are made up of prominent, faculty, Jewish faculty or alumni from that particular university community. Those committees in themselves have become the targets of controversy and turmoil over their makeup with many, including a story I did at Stanford where there was a very vocal group of Stanford alums that protested that school's anti-Semitism committee makeup, and said that the people represented were not, the Jews, their values on Israel did not necessarily align with what a certain section of the Stanford community wanted to see represented on this panel. And so even when there have been attempts to sort of do a low mess, low profile, resolution to these very serious problems, those have in and of themselves been blown up in various ways.
We definitely got questions from folks who are here, folks who signed up to come about what, should they be part of this? If they're concerned about, maybe a school that they attended, should they join in this donor pause in protest? Um, uh, and I guess I'm curious, like based on your reporting, because both what's happening with these investigations and in a lot of cases, Andrew, with like what you've done some reporting about what's actually happening on the campuses. Like what should a observer deduce from knowing that like there's a dust up about anti-Semitism or the treatment of pro-Israel students on a campus? Is the presence of an investigation, like how alarmed should folks be? Does that always mean what can we take away from that about what's actually happening or being felt more broadly on a campus? And how would you advise people to make sense of all of that?
For sure. Well, it's first of all, I would say it's certainly not my place to tell you where and when to, place your money or withhold your money, as long as you're doing that in line with your values. But With regards to specifically like if a campus is under investigation, does that mean bad things? And the answer is not always and not necessarily. The since October 7th, we've been tracking 79 to date active investigations into Title VI shared ancestry complaints, of which we've been able to determine that at least half of them, and likely significantly more, have something to do with the Israel-Hamas war, either investigating anti-Semitism allegations or Islamophobia allegations. The the investigations can be opened for little to no actual evidence. And as I mentioned at the top, sometimes the complainant has only brought up one or two instances. Sometimes it's a single protest. There is not necessarily evidence at the time that there's the sort of pervasive anti-Semitic environment that you might expect by if you see the news that a federal investigation has been opened. That's not to say such an environment doesn't exist, only that when the investigations are ongoing and the department itself has not set clear guidelines as to what it considers when it looks at these investigations and how it's defining certain acts that students or faculty might be taking, it's hard to draw very broad conclusions from that sort of thing. We are certainly seeing more certain universities, certain campuses are making a show of wanting to be welcoming to Jewish students. There's obviously Yeshiva University, which has hired a few faculty from places such as MIT who have spoken out about problems with anti-Semitism on that campus. We've also seen, sort of interestingly, a rise in Christian universities trying to recruit Jewish students, which you can read into that what you will. I don't know that the evidence is there yet necessarily to say whether one kind of campus is going to be safer for Jews than another. But with so many investigations, if you were going to rule out every kind of school that was under an investigation, you would have a very short list indeed of schools that you would deem acceptable.
Can you talk a little bit about who is filing these? You have another story coming that looks at the most prolific filer, and I would hazard that, well, I guess people who have read your investigation will know who that is, but I would hazard that most people who are even close observers of the scene on campus would be surprised by the most prolific filers. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So there are, as I mentioned, outside individuals, outside organizations that have taken a keen interest in Title VI because of the ease by which you can file these complaints. And so the most prolific filer of campus complaints is a single individual named Zachary Marshall, who runs a site called Campus Reform. And he's very open about the fact that he files these complaints and why he does it, which is that he says he's very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism on all these campuses. He has filed somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 complaints, sort of just him, to the Department of Education, sometimes while speaking to Jewish students on those campuses, and sometimes not. Sometimes the evidence comes from social media posts or local news stories, things like that. 12 of those investigations have been opened to date. So those are investigations that are being opened on campuses across the country where investigators are not, so far as we can tell, actually talking to or conversing with the Jewish students who are, who one would assume to actually be the victims of these anti-Semitic environments. There have been similar stories. An individual named Justin Samuels, who is a screenwriter and conservative activist, who, like some other folks in the space, has said that he is using anti-Semitism challenges as a way to fight diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, trying to undermine DEI efforts at various universities and sort of using anti-Semitism or the threat of anti-Semitism as a way to do that. He's opened 3 on his own, all at schools he has not attended. Similar kinds of organizations have done likewise, and there have always been the Title VI space has always had large organizations, including the Brandeis Center and various others that have filed complaints on behalf of Jewish students they say are experiencing anti-Semitism there. The difference between before October 7th and now is that before October 7th, most of these complaints did in fact allege substantive patterns of behavior, and they were almost always done with the full cooperation of the Jewish students at these campuses. neither of those things appear to be the case anymore. Many of these investigations are being opened, again, based on one or two incidents, based on things you might dispute as, covered under the rubric of academic freedom, and without any sort of input from Jewish students on the ground at these campuses.
I think it's worth pausing to just really like hear what Andrew just said, because by by doing what Andrew did, which was to go through each investigation that has been announced, and to be clear, the Department of Education announces its opening investigation. It doesn't say who filed the complaint or what the complaint was about.
Mhm.
Not even, it only says the general category. So Andrew's work has been to figure out, as in as many cases as possible, who originated this complaint and was it about, you know, an event that was in the newspaper on this day or an event that was in the newspaper on another day, and what their motivations are. That's really like that's a huge amount of work. And so I have gotten a couple questions that I can see about the effort it's taken, and I want to just underscore that it's a lot. And then I just want to pause and like step back on what you just said, because we there a source said this to you and it became the headline of your big investigation, and we say it a lot, and it is coming from somebody who's a player in the space, that this is a Wild West, but it really does feel like that, right? You have real students having real experiences, and you also and you have a real effort or a real expression of urgency on the part, at least of the the Department of Education, to address concerning incidents. And you also have a stew of ideological actors who are attaching themselves to this cause, and those, they all have, they may have overlapping goals, but they're not the same. And they're not, right? Their visions are not necessarily the same. And it's a really complex space where I think we don't really exactly know what will become of this tsunami that has been unleashed. But Andrew's watching. And that's, I think, what we can do right now is identify the questions and the fault lines, and what we will look for going forward. So I want to invite all of you to drop your questions. I have a couple that I'll share, but I guess, Andrew, on that note, like what is the next frontier of your reporting here?
Well, gosh, we're figuring that out now. But I think we've always joked that my beat is the yikes beat, and yikes I think can mean a great number of things when it comes to the Jews. And right now it seems to increasingly mean like how we are understanding a national discourse around Israel that has taken unpredictable and sometimes quite frightening turns. And that is true both on campuses and beyond campuses. And so also, I think we're going to start looking at or focusing a bit more on kind of what all of this means for explicitly Jewish spaces, Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, things like that, where we are seeing sort of increased interest from activists targeting those kinds of spaces and what it means. We're going to be continuing to watch what happens on campuses, not only college, but also K through 12. There has certainly been a rise in public teachers unions at some of the largest districts in the country, pushing their school boards to vote on measures such as endorsing a ceasefire or calling Israel's actions a genocide, et cetera. There is just a lot of attention being paid on these kinds of public statements and sort of where they're coming from and where the tenor of this debate is happening. And I also want to say, I mean, I think to the earlier question about sort of like how do we take it in and how do we determine whether a university is like doing the right thing? It definitely does seem like, particularly since that congressional hearing that was, I think many viewed as like a complete disaster for higher education, where you had the presidents of three of the most elite universities in the country all saying that, they didn't know whether calling for the genocide of Jews would violate the university's code of conduct. Since then, we've certainly seen a proactive effort on the part of many university heads to make a show that they recognize that there are problems of anti-Semitism on their campuses and trying to address them, whether it's through these committees that themselves are disputed and are areas for us to focus on and to cover, or whether it's opening, as we just saw at UC Berkeley, opening criminal investigations into anti-Israel protests that turn violent, speakers that get disrupted, or total events shut down, Israeli faculty being targeted in different ways. I want to be careful when I'm talking about the things that I have my eye on, because I certainly don't want it to sound like we're fear mongering or saying that there are no safe places for Jews on college or high school campuses. I don't believe that's true, but I believe that we, in the process of us trying to get a better view on what these experiences are actually like and how the people in charge of protecting and looking after students are thinking about this problem, the more we understand about this, the more we'll be able to inform our readers about what it means to be Jewish on any campus right now.
You mentioned fear, and I think we all can see, and some people in this room probably feel that fear is high. Um, and I guess I'm curious, are you talking to folks out there who have a different view? Are you hearing from anyone involved in the space who is painting a different picture? And if so, what are they telling you? Painting a
I
different
think
picture or interpreting the same picture in a different way, I guess.
Sure. I think there are people who are sort of seeing what's going on now as the next, not necessarily as a uniquely frightening moment, but as sort of the next leg in this ongoing political debate over various changes that have been happening in academia and where Jewish students fit into that, which is an ongoing discussion that often veers kind of more into the philosophical than into like responding to current events, understanding about how Jews fit into DEI best practices, or how we are understood to fit into discrimination law, as the Title VI debates have underlined, and also how something that I'm constantly thinking about is how communities, different marginalized communities that simultaneously feel like they are under threat, respond when sharing an environment together. And so at the same time that a lot of these Title VI complaints are predicated on the idea that Jewish students feel under threat at campuses, there is a whole other group predicated on the idea that Muslim and pro-Palestinian students also feel under threat by things such as these trucks that have been hired to drive through campuses and display, dox the names of students who have signed letters and things like that. And so there are people, I think mostly from outside campuses, who are really trying to dial up the temperature and force some kind of federal action or administrative action. And then there are a lot of groups, including many campus Hillels that I've spoken to or sort of seen interacting, where they're actually trying to dial down the temperature and provide safe places for Jewish students and safe places for cross-community dialogues, and those kinds of things that you might expect to see at a liberal arts college that attracts a diverse student body. It's going to be interesting to see kind of where things shape up, and if the academic experience as we understand it for young Jews is going to become increasingly more ideological, or if there will be some kind of effort to continue to find common ground.
We ran a piece just, well, maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was the day before. The days run together by a professor at Rutgers University, who teaches a class about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how people talk about it. And Rutgers has a large Jewish student population, has a large Muslim student population, and both students from both of those demographics enroll in her class. And the first draft was all about how her campus feels great, and
Mhm.
it's a great example of, where she sits, a great example of how these conversations don't have to be so painful and can be constructive. And we had to send it back and say, did you know there's a federal Title VI investigation open on your campus? And I think that just goes to point, underscore that, like, these are large institutions filled with many different people having many different kinds of experiences, and where where you see something, there's almost certainly more.
Mhm.
um and um and I guess, I had a question that came to me about what it takes to do this reporting. And as Andrew said, we'll never tell you where you ought to put your money, but I will say that
with us.
but it is very expensive to do the best reporting that we want to do. And so we've done, I think, a great job at getting the high level of what Title VI is and how it's being leveraged in this moment. What we want to do next is really paint some of those textured pictures from the bottom up and say, okay, you hear that an investigation is open. Well, what is this school like? And what are the different voices on campus sharing? And what have been the ramifications of this one incident that caused the federal, Department of Education to scrutinize what's happening on this campus? That's, it's a big commitment. We're going to do it. We absolutely appreciate support to do that. And I think we feel every day the both the responsibility of what we're doing, and also we can see ways to do more. So I will just throw that out there. I want to invite other questions right now. And Andrew, I'm curious to hear, I mean, what else
Yeah.
is on your mind, because you're like thinking about all of this all the time.
Well, to your Rutgers example, it's a good point, and it's worth remembering. You could read it in a couple different ways, right? You could read it as like, oh, how could you not know there's this investigation happening? And you could also read it as like, there's an investigation, and also a lot of students feel okay. They feel like they are in a safe place, able to say and express and feel the way that they need to feel. That has not been an uncommon experience in my reporting. I wrote a couple months ago about tensions that were flaring up at George Washington University, right, where the local chapter, the university's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine had projected a bunch of anti-Semitic slogans that many interpreted as anti-Semitic onto campus buildings. And when I called up the director of their Hillel, and she really wanted to emphasize, it's like, yes, some of these things are very troubling, very worrisome. I have to talk to my students about this. Also, this is a great place to be a Jewish student. Like both of these things can coexist sometimes. And it's worth remembering that people feel that way, that there are, as we say often, I feel like multiple truths to any given situation. And I think that it's all one big complicated story that is not going away anytime soon, and that we are going to continue to keep our eye on and really tell all kinds of stories of how Jewish students are feeling.
We got a good question about, I'm going to reframe it a little bit, but we've been talking a lot about the Civil Rights Act and the remedies available to Jewish students today in the year 2024 under a law written in 1964. And I think the question is really like, it sounds a little archaic. Is that really the best tool available right now? You mentioned, Andrew, some other strategies that are more contemporary. And I guess we'd be curious to hear a little bit more about what are the frontiers here? Are there what strategies are being developed, and are there new legal tools that are becoming available?
It's a great question. It's in many ways related to like the more ancient question of what is anti-Semitism, and how do we understand it and experience it? Is it discrimination, or is it something else? Is it something more unique to the relationship between Jews and the rest of the world? And can discrimination law that was written to address a specific problem of racial inequality in our country really speak to our moment right now? And I think it's complicated. I think there are certainly a lot of people and folks in the legal and political space who are making that case that yes, this is discrimination in exactly the same way that you could that you would discriminate against Black students or Latino students or whatever the case may be. You can also discriminate against Jewish students, and these things should be legislated accordingly. And then there are others who say that is not the right way to look at this problem, that in fact there are different ways to think about how to protect the safety and integrity of the Jewish experience on campus, while also embracing more complicated thought patterns about power structures and about civil dialogue and academic freedom and all this kind of stuff that we've been reporting on. there are certainly a lot of tensions out there. They're not going away. I think the sort of lack of clarity around civil rights law at this moment does not feel to me like that can be the permanent state of things. I think this moment is really going to be forcing federal investigators and federal legislators and sort of the administration's response to this very real problem. It's going to force some sort of change or some sort of clarity, and I'm sure we will be seeing that. It's just a question of what it's going to be and how it will affect Jews.
We got a specific question about Penn.
Okay.
Um, you reported that an investigation opened at Penn has been closed.
Yes.
Can you remind us of why and what the implications of that are?
Yeah, it's complicated and weird. I may have mentioned earlier that when the Department of Education opens these discrimination investigations, Title VI, they have this rule. I mean, I guess it's written in their guidelines, but it's sort of not unwritten in a way that when a federal lawsuit is opened into the same university alleging the same things, that the department closes their investigation because theirs is a non-legal investigation, and they assume that even if the plaintiffs are different, that if this is addressing the same thing, it should not be educated in two different governmental divisions at the same time. And so the Department of Education has said, we defer to the court system. If somebody wants to hire a lawyer and sue the university for the same allegations that somebody else has opened a discrimination investigation into, then we're going to let things play out in the courts. The courts have a much more it's sort of like a much more iron hammer way of like enforcing their rulings. And this is versus like kind of the sort of soft power of like some of these sit downs that the education department can have. And so even after this, both of these complaints relate, by the way, to this Palestine Rights Festival that was held on Penn's campus that predated October 7th, that contained many reported instances of very alarming anti-Semitism. And so again, it was about the same thing. And so what could have been played out largely, I don't want to say in secret, but much more quietly, the Department of Education operates sort of in a shadow. They don't comment, they don't tell you about active investigations, they don't tell you until after they're over what has been decided, which again can take years, versus the courtroom where it's very public. We see what's happening at every stage of the game. And so that is the realm, that is the arena in which that particular dispute is playing out now. And it's happened a couple of times where the Department of Education has said, we're not going to investigate this anymore because there is a lawsuit that is alleging basically the same thing. And the recourse being sought is the same as what we would be able to offer anyway.
Can you just gut check me? Like that is a little surprising.
Yeah,
Like, right?
it is. And it's hard to look at that and say also like, oh, they've got, again, 79 outstanding investigations only since October 7th. That's not even to speak of the, several dozen others that predated October 7th that go all the way back to 2016. There's like open, active Title VI investigations that the Department of Education was already responsible for, involving not just anti-Semitism, but all manner of other discrimination cases. It's hard not to think like, well, maybe they were looking for a way to sort of cull their responsibilities. And as knowing that schools like Penn and Harvard, which is the other schools to date where they've closed their investigation for the same reason, they've been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of attention on them, which means it's much more likely that there are going to be some of these lawsuits happening at those schools, as opposed to like the smaller state schools or some of the K through 12 districts that are not in big cities, which are the ones I tend to be more interested in. But at these big schools, big elite schools that are sort of trendsetters, when there is a lot of attention, their lawsuits tend to follow. And the Department of Education, and especially at Harvard, also congressional subpoenas and all of that fun stuff. And so the Department of Education certainly seems to be picking its battles, and finding places where it might not be under quite as much scrutiny to deliver some sort of timely result. And so that seems to be what is happening here. Although again, they do not comment on these
Right.
kinds of investigations.
No, I think that the black box, I mean, you could draw any number of conclusions, and I think you have the most informed perspective of anyone. But when I look at it, and we've had this conversation, it's like, well, if I wanted to just, and I'm not gonna do this, and I'm not suggesting that anybody do it, but if one wanted to like curb the effort to have these investigations take their course, like there seems to be a way to do that. Now, I don't know that there's any actor in this space invested enough to file a bunch of lawsuits they don't intend to carry out. As the department officials have told you, like lawsuits are expensive. That's why we've made this lower barrier to entry way to address allegations of discrimination. But like a bad actor could um, could mess with the whole landscape if they wanted, which
Certainly.
was
And
surprising in your reporting that that was like a possibility.
yeah, there's certainly a lot of behavior that one might associate with bad actors that we have sort of uncovered here. And then there's also, and I should, I touched on this a little bit at the start, but there's also a lot of contradictory behavior or things that would seem to set up irreconcilable differences with how department investigators, anyway, are being charged with approaching the question of discrimination as it relates to Israel and the Palestinian territories, because we have active cases in which a university did not take action when students chanted from the river to the sea. And so there are some active investigations that say for the university not to act in this case was discriminatory to Jewish students and needs to be investigated. And then we have an open investigation into a university, or in this case, a K through 12 school district that did try to take a proactive action when students were chanting this, and it suspended the students. And now that university, that school district is under investigation for Islamophobia. And so these things do not seem to be, there doesn't seem to be a way to say there's a set principle at work here. It's really based on, and the Secretary of Education himself, Miguel Cardona, has told me this, it's based on how the student feels. If they feel like they've been discriminated against, that is the standard that the department uses. And we haven't yet seen the full consequences of that, but it certainly seems like that is not a very sustainable way to talk about discrimination when these ideas are totally in conflict. And we've just seen, I think, landmark discrimination cases being decided in courts of law that have said it is possible to discriminate against white students with a law that was originally designed to promote, the interests of Black students. And so it is throwing the arena of civil rights law even more into a sort of confusing landscape than it already was. And all of this is certainly going to trickle down to how the law relates to Jewish students and to the concept of anti-Semitism.
It is a wild and crazy space. I am really grateful, Andrew, that you are applying your repertorial energies here because I shudder to imagine a world where all of this is happening without any kind of scrutiny. I don't think that would be um, healthy for anyone, and we would all know so much less about real work that's being undertaken to respond to the anxieties and experiences of Jewish students. Just one more question from me, and then this is the last call for those of you in the room. But I've got a couple questions both before this meeting and also while we're here, really responding to the idea that these investigations are going to take a long time and they're very opaque, and um, and a crisis is being experienced right this minute.
Yes.
And so I guess what do you know from your reporting about what folks who are alarmed by this crisis can do now to address it? And I guess what is the short term? Because you're
Yeah.
looking long term. What's the short term?
Yeah, it's a big deal, and I've certainly tried to impress that upon my contacts in the university space. I have unsuccessfully attempted to file Freedom of Information Act expedited requests to the Department of Education under the premise that yes, this is a national emergency, and I'm a Jewish interest reporter, and like our audience deserves to know. And they have decided that is not sufficient to provide me with documentation of these investigations in a timely manner, and so that continues to be a frustration of mine, certainly. I think, in the short term, it can be easy to get caught up in these individual sort of shocking incidents, things that we've reported. But it's always important to look at where things are trending, where the dialogue is trending. If you see a university or reports of someone that seem to be handling it right. I know that Dartmouth has gotten a lot of positive press lately for its handling of campus dialogues around Israel, and certainly there are other campuses trying to emulate that, trying to bring students together. This is often something I hear from the university administrators when I ask them for comment about their investigation. They'll say, "Look, we're doing these dialogue series. We're holding these, forgiveness circles. We're trying to have meaningful, productive conversations." And I would say, look to that. Many of these kinds of events are open to the public, or board meetings, and at which administrators will often, discuss how they are approaching these issues, and see if the administrators, the schools, the universities that you care about are responding in ways that you feel are appropriate. And if not, there are probably public information liaisons, people you could talk to talk about, what might make sense in this space and what might make practical sense, not just we need to shut down all areas of campus speech, which is, by the way, something else that a lot of universities are doing right now. Stories about, Barnard banning any sort of posters on dorm rooms, or schools such as American University sort of like heavily restricting where student demonstrations might happen. I don't know whether that's the answer. I can't say whether these universities whether those represent kind of positive steps in the fight against anti-Semitism. I think that's where things start to get murky. But understanding what the policies are at the schools and the universities that you care about, and understanding how you or your children might fit in to that landscape. Where are the safe spaces? Where are the people looking out for Jewish students? Those are all things that I think are going to be very valuable to understand on the micro level as we are reporting on the broader macro space.
Um, Absolutely. And I'm again really glad, Andrew, that you're taking a look at all of that. And will help us over time understand, what the trade-offs are of particular steps that colleges and universities have taken. I'll just also note that when I spoke to and this was several months ago, spoke to an activist who appeared in your story, Julia Jassy, who's the founder of Jewish on Campus. Her take to me was very clear, which was that um, students and their parents oughtn't come to firm conclusions about whether a school is safe based on any one particular incident, that the most important thing for students and their families is to feel educated about recognizing anti-Semitism, have a plan in advance about if you're in a situation that feels wrong to you, how you personally are going to respond, to know what resources you can draw on, and to have a strong sense of self. And I think that has stuck with me as a different way to think about the landscape that is a very complicated and difficult one, and something that for folks in this room, if you have college students in your lives, that is something that you can, to the question of what can we do right now, that is something you can do right now, which is to be a support for the college students in your lives. Were you
And
gonna say?
and I think also, if you are a Jewish college student, to know your rights, which is which is a sort of cliched phrase, but in this case it means these pretty much every college and university has in place a guideline of how to deal with bias and harassment. And there are mechanisms students and members of the community can use to report these things. What the Department of Education is supposed to do is step in when those internal processes don't work, but you have to try those first. And I think it helps to give, hopefully, some degree of good faith to the prospect that your university will want to help you feel welcomed on campus and will want to take steps to make sure that you do feel welcomed on campus. And if things go south from there, let us know. Our tip line is open, and that's where we get interested.
Absolutely. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for staying in touch. and telling us about what's happening in your communities and the communities of folks in your lives. And thank you for, any of the many ways that you can help us to continue this ambitious, important, and impactful reporting. So thank you to Andrew for doing it and to all of you for reading and coming along. Please stay in touch.
Thank you, everybody.